Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the NANOCO Group PLC full year results investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab that's just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please just simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all of the questions that are submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to submit the following poll, and if you could give that your kind attention, I'm sure the company would be most grateful. And I'd now like to hand you over to CEO Brian Tenner. Good morning, sir.
Thanks very much, Jake, and good morning to everyone who's listening. So this is Brian Tenner, CEO of NANOCO. With me, I have Liam Gray, our CFO. We're going to run you through the highlights or the main points coming out of the analyst presentation that we gave yesterday. We won't cover everything because there have been quite a lot of questions and a lot of detailed questions submitted today. So I want to use as much of our time as possible answering those questions. So if folk want to have a more detailed run through of the presentation deck that we're using today, the best advice would be to go to our website and listen in on yesterday's presentation where we turned every page, whereas today we'll be really drawing out those highlights. So without further ado, turning to slide 3 in our deck, just looking at the highlights of what we've done over the last 12 months. From an operational point of view, all of this is basically added momentum so that we're now generating longer-term commercial visibility. So just looking at what we've done, we signed a major full-year contract with a European customer working in the sensing applications. Previously, we'd been working on 3-month, 6-month type rolling contracts. So it was gratifying to get a full year contract extension. And that full year, 3 of the deliverables, the first 2 are to get 2 different materials to a fully validated for production readiness stage before the end of the contract. The contract ends in May 23, but we expect to be ready ahead of that with those 2 products. And the third deliverable is actually developing a brand new material based on a brand new material set for that customer, all of which is evidence of their long-term commitment to this aspect and these types of sensors. You'll see later on, I'll talk about what we've actually done in detail in the sensing area, and we've significantly expanded both the number of customers that we're dealing with, but also in the number of materials and material wavelength combinations, and you'll see that later on. From a litigation point of view, back in May, the Patent Trial and Appeal Board validated all 5 of the patents that we had brought in this case, and all 47 of their associated claims. And basically, the story of this year from a litigation point of view is we've successfully cleared every single hurdle in front of us and cleared them by quite some margin. Obviously, there's still hurdles ahead, but having not already fallen, we're in a good position to take the last few hurdles. And then finally, again, from an operational point of view, we're almost completely out of our Manchester facility. The last shutdown and dilapidations of that will happen just before the end of this calendar year. Our operations are already up and running in Runcorn, and we're just recommissioning a couple of more processes, and that process will complete to save us around £700,000 a year once the consolidation is complete. Just very quickly on the financial highlights. Twice during the year, we raised revenue expectations, and each time we achieved those expectations. We also delivered further savings during the year, and those will then add to the extra savings we're expecting from the Manchester exit. But it basically means that our cash costs, which were around or just above £400,000 a month, they're now actually below £400,000 a month. Then in June, we had an equity issue, and that was very significantly oversubscribed, and we took the opportunity to raise or issue the full 5% allowed to us under our AGM resolutions, and that raised £5.4 million net for the company. So the combination of that improving commercial outlook, that fundraise and reduction in costs and expected further reduction in our costs means that our organic cash runway extends comfortably out into calendar year 2025. And that is actually beyond the point in time at which we expect to be self-financing. So actually, assuming we achieve that target of being self-financing before calendar year 25, then our cash runway actually will extend indefinitely, as long as we can maintain that position of actually being a self-financing business. So those are the highlights for the year. Just going over the page, just a very simple summary. We've got three key sources of value in the business. Two of them are organic. One of them is litigation. The two organic sources, one is in sensing markets, sensing applications. That's a lot of the stuff I was just talking about in the highlights. And there we are, as I mentioned, getting closer to production. And our customer has still got published roadmaps that says they're going to be in commercial production in calendar year 23. So that's why we're confident that we will be in commercial production in calendar year 23 as well. And the other organic side of the business is display. It had been very, very quiet for the last couple of years. Almost all of our organic activity was focused on sensing, but it's been pleasing again this year that actually interest in both cadmium-free quantum dot solutions, but also specifically in NANOCO, has been growing. And we have re-engaged at an early stage and at a small scale with a number of potential display customers. And of course, people will know the display market. Most of the players are very large, and a bit like the sensing market. If you can get designed into a product, if you can get into an application, then it almost immediately presents you with significant volumes. And when I say significant, what I mean is the sort of volumes, even at a small scale, that would get us to that self-financing level of income in the business. And again, just as a reminder, we estimate today our break-even revenue figures around £5 million a year. And lastly, on the litigation, again, I mentioned we cleared all the hurdles. I'll say more about it later. There's a couple of detailed slides on it. But again, we won all our IPRs. The nature of the decision by the PTAB in rejecting Samsung's applications for those IPRs gives us confidence actually that even though Samsung are appealing those, we're in a good position to resist those appeals and actually win them and have our IP fully validated thereafter. I'm just going to now skip a slide. You'll see slide 6, there's a little bit about market and market opportunities. That's the kind of thing, if you want a more detailed picture, and just listen to yesterday's webcast. Some of the information in there is repeats from previous years. So what I'm focusing on is slide 7. So this is what's explaining the things that we have done and the things we've achieved in the last 12 months with regard to our sensing product portfolio. Again, you'll have seen a similar graphical analysis before, and what this is emphasizing, back in early 2018, we were a one product, one customer company. The numbers inside the circles you see here are the number of customers that we're dealing with, either on that material or on that wavelength or whatever it happens to be. And again, you can see from the legend, products start at development, they move through optimization, they go to scale up, they then go to production validation, and finally, the ultimate goal obviously is to be in production itself. And again, just to clarify, because folk have asked about what does validation mean, you actually have to validate your materials at every step of the way. So if you develop a brand new material, then you have to validate it. What does that mean? It means that you can replicate it and you can make it consistently inside its parameters. Then when you optimize it for an application, you need to validate it again because it needs to stay locked. It needs to stay stable. Then once you put it through a scale-up process, again, you need to validate it. And if you like, the big ticket validation is right at the end when everything's locked, everything's stable, and you're saying you're now, it's like in NASA or Cape Canaveral, you're ready to launch. You really are ready to go into commercial production. So when we talk about end product validation, that's what we mean. But just remember, there are various validation steps along the way. And the last point to highlight on this chart is where you've got the little black boxes outlining some of those circles below. That's where there's been change or progress during the last 12 months. So that's where we've increased the number of customer engagements. So for example, if you look at one of those boxes, now I got 5 customers looking at a new material set B. We deliberately do not define those material sets A, B, C, because some of the chemistry and some of what's in them is confidential, if not trade secret. And again, you can see that there are 2 products that are significantly further on than all of the other customer product combinations. and that's the near infrared application that's already at the validation stage and has been for a while. But that's the thing that, again, the validation for that should complete during the remainder of the 1-year contract with the European electronics customer. And you can see the second product that's moved from optimization into scale up, and that will also go through validation before the end of the current contract with the European customer. So it still remains our goal during 2023 calendar year to actually have one product in production and a second product validated for production. Then going to go over the page again. I'll skip the page on the market opportunity for display. Again, if you want to know more about that, just listen in to yesterday's webcast. So now I'm just looking at what have we done during display, or what have we seen as changes during display during the year. So I mentioned that we've had a lot more inbound inquiries and a lot more interest in specifically in NANOCO's CFQD quantum dots for use in displays. That's being driven by a number of factors. We're seeing that there's increased awareness of RoHS, so restriction of hazardous substances, around the world. There are a lot of TVs out there that have still got cadmium in them, and they're still being made and they're still being sold. We're also aware that with increasing awareness among the big name brands, certainly the big name Western brands, about the implications of ESG, the environment, etc., that they are not waiting. They do not want to wait until RoHS becomes legislation and they're obliged to change their ways. A lot of them are now talking about trying to get ahead of the curve and get into more environmentally friendly CFQD type solutions for displays before they're forced there by RoHS. We also think that getting our core IP validated by USPTAB, that's actually raised risks in the minds of a number of players in the market. So we're aware of competitors who regularly threaten people with their IP. But that IP that they're threatening people with has never actually really been tested in court, whereas ours has. And so particularly if we win the first round trial with Samsung, I think there are a number of market players, whether manufacturers of quantum dots or consumers of quantum dots in TVs and displays, that can expect a polite letter from NANOCO just pointing out our IP, the quality of that IP, and that it's already been validated in a IPR and in a court process. You'll also see that there are more devices that are talking about adopting quantum dots into displays, so whether that's tablets, phablets, phones, advertising boards, etc., etc. So that's why there appears to be some refreshing, re-energized new interest in cadmium-free quantum dots. So in terms of what that means for our actual activities, we've restarted small-scale sampling for some potential customers. We're discussing potential technical development agreements. Again, the thing to remember about display is we already had fully validated, from our perspective, quantum dots for use in display, unlike sensing, where we're actually starting with the materials we're at the development end. So if I was referring to display in the same ways that we talk about the sensing materials have to go from development through optimization, etc. For the display dots, they're already through development, they're already through optimization. A number of generations are already successfully through scale up, and actually, from our perspective, they're ready for final production validation. So if a customer did decide to go for a NANOCO CFQD solution, you would not be looking at a 2, 3, 4 year development cycle that you see in sensing. It could be anywhere between 12, maybe 15 months just to get into the final device. So it's encouraging. The one thing to emphasize, it's still early days, and we'll see where it goes from here. Just turning over the page then. You'll find, if you go to this deck on the website, there's a recap of some key points about the litigation in the appendices. But I'm not going to go through all that today, just in the interest of time, or yesterday for that matter. So key events in FY22. Well, I already mentioned about PTAB validating NANOCO's IP, all 5 patents, all 47 claims. We know that Samsung have lodged notices to appeal those. The appeals are expected to be filed in November 22. We know that because they got Samsung asked for an extension to the deadline to file those appeals, and that 3-month extension was granted. So November 22 for their actual appeals, around the end of 2023, maybe early 24 for the outcome of those appeals. As I mentioned earlier, the way in which Samsung's original claims were rejected makes us confident, but purely from a statistical point of view, and again, just to emphasize, I think we've always told people, if 90% of people win and 10% of people lose, that's interesting statistically until you find out whether or not you are in the 90% or you're in the 10%. But purely from a statistical point of view, more than 70% of all PTAB appeals, the appellant's case is actually rejected in full, and it's less than 10% where it would be accepted in full, and the remaining 20%, some of their cases accepted, some is rejected. So basically you're saying in 90% of the cases, the person with the patents, in this case NANOCO, comes out either with everything or at least with some of their patents intact. The other big event in FY22 was the pre-trial conference. Again, Samsung were trying to have all of our experts struck out. They were trying to have all of our damages models struck out. They were trying to have all of our damages models experts struck out. And they were also seeking summary judgment to have the whole case thrown out, i.e. for the judge to say, there is no case to answer. It is over. Every single one of those was rejected. I'll answer it now because it's a question that has been submitted. Someone asked the question about the red dots. Yes, we actually believe we do have an infringement read on Samsung and the red dots, but as we've explained before, the 12 hours of a trial, if you have to explain 2 different processes, 2 different ways of infringing, etc., do cross-examinations, do everything else, cover your damages, we were always going to narrow our case. So the fact that Samsung won dismiss the case against red dots, well, we didn't actually argue against it. So that tells you what we think about that. And again, it was important. We didn't think it was a serious or significant risk, but it clearly was a risk that there was a motion for summary judgment to have the whole thing thrown out. Now, we haven't talked about it much because we only really talk about what we think are material risks, but it was a real risk, and the judge dismissed that motion, and by dismissing that motion, the judge was basically saying, right, this thing is now ready to go to trial. And that's why I used the phrase, we are going to trial, because the judge said we were, because he threw out the motion to dismiss. But all of this has then allowed, those who are watching the case closely, allowed us to focus our case much more narrower down to just a couple of patents and a handful of claims. We've also reduced the number of damages models we're going into court. And again, that is just simply a reflection of the fact to emphasize, we've got 12 hours to cover everything, present everything, cross-examination, because the trial typically starts on a Monday, doesn't have to, but they're 5 days long, and it ends on the Friday with a verdict. And everything that goes with that, which I'll come into just over the page. Again, we've been bumped a couple of times from the trial scheduling. Undoubtedly, from the court and the judge's perspective, there is a logic to what's going on. Unfortunately, we're not privy to that. So, we went from being second in the schedule to being 6th in the schedule. We understand now we're 4th in the schedule. That doesn't mean you are going. It doesn't mean you're not going. The worst case scenario, we are advised by local counsel, the worst they've ever seen, or the hardest to deal with, is being told on the day of the trial when you're there expecting and you're sitting outside the courtroom and being told it's not happening, see you in a month. So normally the court is conscious of people's time and money, and they do try to give people advance notice, but they can't always do that. So usually you find out a week or so in advance whether you were scheduled, 2nd, 5th, 6th. You either get released or you get told you are number 1 and you're going. And we've now told the markets that when we are confident that we are going, that's when we'll do our next update, rather than just comment on being in a schedule, because it doesn't really add up to much. And the last thing we did during the year is we filed suit in Germany. And again, as we said, we're reviewing options in other territories. Just going over the page then, the litigation timetable. And as say, this is an indicative timetable. Some of these processes are more tightly controlled by statute and regulation. Some of them are subject to so many different moving parts and decisions to appeal and then extensions for appeals, et cetera, et cetera. But just in real summary, the IPR process, so the validity process, the Patent Trial and Appeal Board process, that is a more controlled, more tightly controlled, regulated process. So as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting the actual appeals by Samsung to be filed in November 2022, and we're expecting then the answer between 12 and 15 months later, so around the end of 23, early 24. And I've already talked about statistics and confidence and likelihoods, etc., around the PTAB process. If you then turn to the trial and the potential appeal timeline, so jury verdict, we are estimating that could be before the end of this year. We know there are 2 more trial dates for the end of this year. One's 31st of October and one's 5th of December. We then know that there are 2 more trial dates in January, 2 in February, and 1 or 2 in March. Again, just to be clear, only one case can be heard each week because there's only one judge dealing with IP cases in the Eastern District of Texas, or rather, we've only got one judge. We can't go to a second judge or a third judge. So our judge can only hear one case whenever he sits, and clearly he's got other stuff to do between trials. So it could be before the end of this year, which would be nice, but equally it could spill into the first half of next year. You shouldn't read anything into scheduling. There isn't anything to be read into scheduling. It is just a thing. So you will then get a jury verdict, and if that verdict is successful, there will be a damages award. So the jury will specify a number. They will specify if it was deliberate or if it was willful, and they will specify if that covers all damages or just the past. Immediately after the trial, there'll be a whole bunch of post-trial motions. So these aren't appeals; these are just procedural objections, etc., to try and get things redone or thrown out or started again or whatever it happens to be. They're the normal part of the hurly-burly, and there are normally a lot of them because people don't want the judge writing certain things in his final report, so they'll be looking to have things struck out, etc. It's all extremely tactical. Whether it's 3 months or 6 months later after the verdict, then the judge will issue their formal written opinion. So if there's been a finding of willfulness, the judge will decide on the multiplier. Again, we've explained that can be up to 3 times, but in Texas, it's typically around 1.5 times multiplier. If the jury have also said that their damages number only applies to the past, then the judge will work out what he thinks is a appropriate running royalty. That running royalty could be based on the verdict for past damages. It could be bigger than the verdict for past damages. It could be smaller than the verdict for past damages. There are a whole host of ways of calculating that number. It just has to be done reasonably. And unfortunately, that's all the guidance we can give. Some people say running royalty should include willfulness multipliers because any future infringement is obviously deliberate if you've been found guilty of infringing. Other people say, no, that's a special one-off because you didn't know up until that point, so you shouldn't be penalised for the same basis going forward or whatever it is. So there are arguments both ways. So again, you can't automatically assume that any running royalty will be bigger or lower or the same. You just know that there will be one. After the judge has issued his formal opinion, then, so again, around Q2, Q3, 23, that's when both parties can submit their formal appeals. This is the piece of the process that then, I won't say how long's a piece of string, but it can go on for some time. Now, again, we've got an advantage. We're in Texas. Things move relatively fast compared to some other territories. But those appeals could last, the whole appeal process could take up to 3 to 4 years. Why could it take so long? Well, one outcome of an appeal is a retrial. Go back, start again. You want a jury to give you a decision on a verdict, a decision on willfulness, a decision on damages, et cetera, et cetera. You could have an appeal that says, actually, we're happy with the verdict, we're happy with willfulness, but just we don't like the damages, so go back and have a damages trial only. And if you look at the trial that we were bumped for in early September, PNC against USAA, that was a trial just about damages. So that's why that process could take a long time. And all of that, I have to emphasize, presupposes that there is no early settlement. But of course, any settlement, any early settlement, it's going to be up to Samsung if they're prepared to engage on meaningful discussions about fair value that reflects the global nature of our patents and the lifetimes of our patents. So that one, to a large extent, is outside of NANOCO's control. The reason that we've highlighted the German injunction on here is that when faced with an injunction, most companies, certainly in Germany, will very rapidly enter settlement negotiations because nobody wants to be banned from selling their product. Now, this process isn't without risk. The potential German injunction could be awarded in 2024, but the actual validity decision won't necessarily be taken for another 6 months. So if we impose the injunction in March 24, we might have to put up a bond for loss of profits for Samsung, which would clearly be a significant amount of money. Whereas we'd have the option to wait another 6 months, and if validity was confirmed, you've now got injunction, you've now got infringement, you've now got validity. Yes, there'd be appeals processes, but it'd be a much lower risk to put in a bond there if you wanted to enforce that injunction. And again, all of these things and the extra lawsuits around the world, they're all designed to put pressure on Samsung to be reasonable and actually engage in some sort of sensible settlement discussions. So that's it from me, and I'll just hand over to Liam, who's going to do a quick run through on financial highlights.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. So looking at the financial highlights for the year ended 31st July 2022, we'll start with the top line. And our revenue and other operating income has increased by 24% on the prior year. The operational leverage in the business, along with the cost savings we've implemented previously, means this has had a significant impact on improving the adjusted EBITDA by 26%. And then, as we communicated previously, looking forward, we expect our revenue for FY23 to increase by about 20% on FY22, with a very similar cost base to this year. If we look at our cost base, in early calendar year 22, we decided to consolidate our operations into the Runcorn site and close the Manchester site. The closure of the first floor in Manchester was completed in FY22, and we anticipate the completion of the exit of the ground floor in Q2 of FY23. Given the tight cost control of the previous years, we are investing more money in our staff, and I've had a company-wide pay rise in addition to other benefits, and intend to continue to invest in both our people and the office environment in Runcorn. And then coming to cash, the fundraise we completed in June 22 raised 5.4 million net of fees and takes our cash runway out to calendar year 25, which is past our expected break-even point. Moving on to the income statement for the year. This shows our FY22 income statements compared to FY21. As mentioned, the revenue increase is 0.4 million to 2.5 in the year. This increase has been driven by the work we are doing with the European electronics customer, with increases in both services revenue and the products sold. In addition, there are a number of other projects in both sensing and display which have contributed to this increase. Other operating income increased year on year due to the completion of the grant relating to the development of a COVID-19 diagnostic test. Other costs in total have fallen in the year, reflecting our reduced cost base. Moving down the table, our share-based payments and associated charges have increased due to the increase in the company's share price year on year. And then we have depreciation and amortization, which are largely in line with prior year, but these will fall next year due to the closure of the Manchester site. And finally, we have our R&D tax credit of 0.5 million being offset by the full year impact of interest on the loan notes taken out in July 21. But a key metric for us here is the adjusted EBITDA, which has fallen 0.7 million from 2.8 million in the prior year to 2.1 million in the current year. So the next slide shows our revenue and billings, and we're going to skip through this one and the next couple, just to get to the summary so that Brian can do the Q&A at the end. So financial summary. Regarding FY23, we opened the year with a contracted order book of 2.1 million, which is more than double the opening order book for FY22. Based on our current pipeline of work, we anticipate revenue being approximately 20% higher than that of FY22. Our cash cost base remains similar, with some savings from the reduction in property costs being offset by increased elsewhere, such as payroll. But that does mean our break-even revenue point is now around 5 million. On capabilities, we now have all staff working on one site, which provides both operational and financial benefits. All staff are working on revenue-generating work, and the production facility in Runcorn, when operating at full capacity, can generate around £130 million of revenue. And then on cash, our average net monthly cash burn is now below 0.2 million. As mentioned before, the business has strong operational leverage, so any further commercial wins will have a significant impact on both EBITDA and cash.
Attention, please.
And finally, we believe our current cash resources are enough to see us past expected break-even point.
To be tested. Please take no further action.
And apologies, we have a fire alarm test.
Attention, please. Attention, please. We are investigating an alarm condition. It may be necessary to evacuate the building. Please await further announcement.
Attention, please. Attention, please. Please leave the building immediately. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit. Do not use the lifts.
The weekly test is now complete. If you had any difficulty hearing the message or fire alarm signals, please report to the main reception desk. Please respond to all future fire alarms. Thank you.
Apologies for that short interlude, but I think that was me finished on finance. So with that, I'll pass you back to Brian to summarise, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Okay. Thanks, Liam. So just a summary of the year and what Liam has been alluding to in respect of FY23 as well. So we are still saying, we are participating in global markets for both sensing and display. The sensing markets are constantly getting bigger. More players are coming in. More players are looking at applying quantum dots into their solution stacks. And as I say, it's gratifying that on display, things, certainly from NANOCO's perspective, seem to be re-energizing with a number of new engagements. By keeping open our Runcorn facility, we have retained our capability for large-scale production in both markets, so in sensing and in display. In sensing, that extends to many hundreds of millions of units, or the equivalent hundreds of millions of sensors from our material. And on the display side, it's handfuls of millions of TVs. But when you consider that the entire market outside of Samsung for CFQD TVs is less than 1 million, we could actually service the entire market if we needed to from the production facility that we do have, and it could be expanded relatively simply and at relatively low cost. And I just want to emphasize success in either of those markets does get us to that break-even point. Clearly, that's just the first goal. We want to get into commercial production, then we want to get to break-even, but the revenue generating capacity of our facilities is such that we should be able to push on strongly into much higher levels of revenue and profitability heading out in the medium to longer term. In terms of outlook, we are expecting this year a steady incremental revenue growth as we move into production. You'll see in our actual detailed preliminary results and in our annual report that we have assumed that we have a very small actual commercial production starting at the back end of this financial year, so around June, July 2023. And that's consistent with our expectation of being in commercial production. Again, we're being conservative. We're assuming that is a low volume use case, that it won't involve a mobile phone handset. It's more likely to be, an application in whether it's, headset, glasses, agriculture, just something not significant volume, but from a substantive and qualitative point of view, absolutely transformational for NANOCO in that it'll be our first actual commercial product being serviced on a global level since the company started up back in 2003. We already mentioned our organic cash runway extends out to calendar year 25, which is beyond the point at which we expect to be break even. So it'll be nice not to have to just constantly be worried about running out of money. What over the last few years has felt like every 6 to 12 months. And both display and sensing market opportunities, to our mind and as part of our strategy, they're both clear path to break even in the short to medium term. And, as I've said, short to medium term means, at the latest by calendar year 25, if not before. So in terms of the value in the business, there's still the transformational potential in the Samsung litigation. We are expecting that trial relatively soon. Still expect visibility in late 2022 on potential sensing production revenue in 2023. Just to be clear, visibility does not mean an actual PO. It does not mean actually in production. It could, but it means more just confidence that actually, yes, we're in the final stages of product validation and then just awaiting customer orders. And so effectively, we've got two twin tracks to significant shareholder value growth in the short to medium term. One is the organic business, whether it's through display or sensing, and the other is the sensing business. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'll hand you back to Jake for just a second while we gather ourselves for the questions that we're going to be going through.
Brian, Liam, that's great. And thank you very much indeed for your presentation this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab that's situated on the top right-hand corner of your screen. But just while the team take a few moments to review those questions that were submitted already, I would like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Liam, Brian, we did obviously receive a number of pre-submitted questions ahead of today's event, as well as you can see in the Q&A tab itself, a number of questions that have made their way through during today's presentation. So thank you to all of those on the call for taking the time to submit their questions. And if I could just hand back to you to address those where it's appropriate to do so, and then I'll pick up from you at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jake. Right, so I am going to have to talk faster than normal, and apologies if the Irish accent gets in the way, but I think we've got more than 30 questions that we need to answer. So we will kick off immediately. So question one, could we seek an injunction against Samsung to stop them selling products with NANOCO's technology as opposed to merely trying to recover damages, as that may bring them to the table to negotiate the settlement or agreement if successful? Simple answer is it really depends on the jurisdiction. So in the United States, I think we've already explained, if we were a direct competitor, i.e. if we made TVs, then you've got a chance of getting an injunction. But the truth is the US preferred model is financial compensation. So no, you will not get an injunction in the US. And I say that even though our claim asks for one. You always ask for one and you'll never get it. Okay, so that's the US, whereas in Germany, actually the only remedy that you seek is an injunction. Damages comes afterwards. If you get an injunction, then you can have a negotiation about money and financial compensation, etc. But the standard remedy in Germany is an injunction. Other territories, the simple answer is it depends. There's a whole range. Some of them, it's almost impossible to get an injunction. Some of them, like Germany, that's what they give you. Others, it's somewhere in between. Others, you could get both. So it really does depend. But we're absolutely conscious of the fact that a potential injunction in Germany would persuade Samsung, potentially to change their stance in any discussions or appeals processes going on in other territories, such as the United States. Question two, on reading the court papers in the public domain, Samsung appeared to have reasonable grounds to question NANOCO's patents on validity on sufficiency, and there's an unresolved argument between experts regarding the appropriate level of posita. Please, can you provide investors with more comfort on these points? Okay, the really, really high-level answer is, and I think we made this clear at the start of this whole process, is we are only going to comment on material risks and issues. If I give you an example, if every time I talked about production coming out of Runcorn, I had to talk about the fact that there's a risk of, the facility being hit by a plane or going on fire or burning to the ground, it'd be a very, very long-winded process. So on the specifics of these two, yes, theoretically, they are open issues, but does the company feel any need whatsoever to make any comments on them? No, we don't. So like the factory point, yes, is a fire risk a real risk? Yes, it is. Of course it is. But do we feel any need to comment on it every time we talk about production? Absolutely not. Clearly, you know that we've got some of the best lawyers in the world working on this, and we do follow the advice. Do we think that these are material risks that we need to comment on? No. And the last point I'd ask you all to consider is, in the same way NANOCO only have 12 hours in this upcoming case, so does Samsung. And if they want to look at, theoretical, highly technical, arguments to persuade a jury of lay people of a point, well, that's their choice if they want to do that. Next question, can you provide guidance on the timeline of the German-funded lawsuit? I think I may have already covered this, that expect an infringement decision in March 24. And if we win, we can impose an injunction if we deposit a bond for lost profits. Alternatively, we could wait until October 24, which is roughly when you get the decision on validity of the patents. So then you've got validity and infringement. So again, you could still go for an injunction, obviously much lower risk there, or you could wait for the appeals processes. And if you win the appeals processes, assuming there are some, then actually you can go and impose the injunction. And obviously you don't need a bond because it's been fully resolved in your favor. So that's the timeline of the German litigation. And you can see that it does interweave with the US litigation. And clearly, if we bring actions in any other territories or any of the other territories we're evaluating, one of the factors to consider will be whether or not that positively interweaves with some of those other processes to bring extra pressure to bear in the process. Question 4 looks like it's got about 5 or 6 embedded questions in it. Question 1, I saw the notice that the Samsung litigation will proceed with a focus on Samsung's use of IP for green dots only. Can you say whether we think they infringed on red? So red and green have got different processes. Yes, we do think we have an infringement read on the red dot, but as I've explained previously, we had to narrow our case. And again, having to explain 2 different processes, 2 different infringements, a bunch of different evidence, expert testimony, etc. We were always going to drop down to focusing the case more narrowly. It's also worth bearing in mind there are 4 times more green dots than a red dot in a TV, and it's much, much harder to make a green dot than it is to make a red dot. So if you're talking about the relative value of green or red, you would much rather have an infringing green dot than an infringing red dot, just because there's 4 times as many and just because one's a lot harder to make, meaning actually the person who's adopting the technology has taken even more shortcuts if they've actually copied the really hard method rather than copying the more simple one. And as was said before, the time that we've got to actually present our case just means that we can't cover everything. So that's why we've narrowed the case. Next question, how does winning all of the patent challenges affect the strength of your position in sensing? So the very, very simple answer is that on material set A, so the products that we're hoping to go into commercial production in calendar year 23, these patents have no connection whatsoever. Yeah, the sensing material set A is not a CFQD. It is completely different. So the idea if there's any connection between those 2 materials and the IP sitting behind them, get that out of your head. There is no connection. However, material set B and C, and when it comes to D and E, are actually very closely related to CFQD. Now, commercially, they're further away from us. All of those products are in the development stage. But the simple answer is the patent wins in the US, they're on CFQD. They're relevant for display, they're relevant for lighting, etc., but they're not relevant for the immediate sensing opportunity, but they are relevant for future sensing opportunities in material sets B and C. So hopefully that answers that part of that question. If your sensor customers were to bring in a second supplier in the case of high demand, would that second supplier need to license the IP from you? So the truth is, if they were using any NANOCO IP, know-how or trade secrets, then yes, they would have to have a license. However, as we've explained in the past, on material set A, we do not have as much IP there as we do on B and C, and this is a more broadly known and understood process. So it's theoretically possible that someone could find a way to make the identical product, but in a different way that wasn't infringing our IP. Whether or not that's easy or likely, I don't know. But certainly our agreement with our customer specifically says if a second supplier is being brought in, then that second supplier, if they're going to use any of our IP, they have to take out a license. It's also worth noting that our contracts with our big customers specify our minimum share of any future volume, which therefore limits the participation of second sources. But of course, these supply chains are important enough that there has to be a second source. And so inevitably there will be a second source, although of course it's always possible for the customer themselves to be the second source and have an in-house fallback second source. Next question, should we definitely expect a trial now? Has the window for a negotiated settlement closed? I think you can see in the court papers that have been submitted, they're publicly available, that actually there was an open window before this case even started. You know, we were talking to Samsung for a number of years before Valentine's Day back in 2020, when we actually first filed this suit. The truth is the window is always open, and I mean always open. The question is whether or not there are any messages passing through it. That's another question. But the truth is the window never closes. Again, to give you a real life example, one of our advisors had a case that settled while the jury had retired and were considering their verdict. So, you know, there were settlement discussions going on during the first 4.5 days of the trial, and while the jury was out, a settlement was reached. So there is no cutoff. There is no point in time at which a settlement becomes impossible. It's all just down to whether or not the parties can actually get close enough together to actually make it likely that there will be a settlement. But one thing to remember is, you know, people know, I think they're familiar with, only 1 in 20 cases gets to trial. Well, the ones that do go to trial and then there's a successful verdict, or a verdict one way or the other, only a tiny proportion of those actually end up with a legally enforced judgment. The rest settle in some way, shape or form at some point after that. You know, so, you know, statistically, it wouldn't surprise me if more than 99% of all cases settle, whether it's before trial, during trial, after trial. And it's only a tiny, tiny percentage where you end up with all the appeals exhausted and the US Supreme Court's basically telling someone, pay up. Next question. I've seen some positive comments recently around the promise of compound semiconductors for infrared sensing. Are we able to comment? Well, effectively, that is what we are working on, a CMOS sensor with quantum dots attached to it. That's putting quantum dots onto a compound semiconductor. A CMOS sensor is a complementary metal oxide semiconductor. There might be a more technical aspect to this question that my law degree isn't fathoming. If there is, whoever submitted this one, feel free to write to the company and we can explain in more detail. But basically, this is what we're about. And a CMOS sensor with quantum dots, again, if you look in the pack we presented today and yesterday, there are significant advantages over naked silicon. And also the main advantage against in-gas sensors is the fact that they're between 100 and 1,000 times cheaper for a CMOS sensor with quantum dots than to go the in-gas solution. So fundamentally, that is what we're about, applying quantum dots to compound semiconductors for sensing applications. Next question, what has NANOCO learned most from its ongoing litigation with Samsung? Sort of question that inspires either rude or glib answers, so I'll avoid all of that. I think the thing to be clear about is every single piece of confidential information from Samsung's perspective, NANOCO has never seen. Our lawyers are allowed to see it, but you know, if I ask our lawyers, so how does Samsung make their quantum dots? They just look at me and say, well, I can't tell you that because it's confidential. So if someone was thinking that we were learning their secrets through this process, and the same applies in reverse. Anything that we marked as secret or confidential, Samsung won't have learned. Now, it's a moot point whether or not Samsung did all their learning during the 7 years that we worked together. But the whole point is I'm saying that we haven't learned much, if anything, about Samsung and its process during the ongoing litigation. I think one thing that we can say is that our confidence that Samsung are infringing has grown, and that's why we've carried on with this process, not just because of success at PTAB and other litigation points, but yeah, we are confident through the process, and our advisors are confident through the process that we have got a strong case. We've also grown in confidence that anyone making CFQD is likely to be infringing our patents. And when I say anyone, we mean anyone making cadmium-free quantum dots, because we don't think there is an easy way or a way to actually make them at mass scale that doesn't infringe some of our core seeding patents, etc. I guess the other thing we've learned is that, about the US litigation process, but we'd hopefully, well, you never know, we may have to go down this route again with another company, but we'll see. So we've learned a lot, but certainly nothing that would be confidential or commercial from a Samsung perspective. Question 6, if Samsung wins its lawsuit, if NANOCO wins its lawsuit against Samsung, do NANOCO expect Samsung and its current display customers to then source from NANOCO? Simple answer is no. The typical solution in the United States, whether negotiated or imposed, produces a license, and a license payment. That license is a license to make or have made. So it is almost inevitable that when this case against Samsung in the US ends, that Samsung will be able to legitimately and legally carry on using their current supplier, Hansol, as a source of quantum dots. As I said before, in the US, this is not an injunction territory, so we get financial compensation. It's possible that you could try to negotiate being a supplier, but equally, Samsung could turn around and say, we've got a well-established supply chain and we're happy with the quality standards, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want to interrupt that, so therefore we want to stay with the current suppliers. So the simple answer is no, we don't expect Samsung or its current display customers to have to source from NANOCO. Next question was, so what sales volume is anticipated? Well, the same answer. If we're not going to be supplying NANOCO with Samsung with quantum dots, then there wouldn't be a sales volume. What leverage, next question, what leverage will NANOCO have to force current customers of this stolen IP to make future purchases from NANOCO? Well, again, it's the same point. If Samsung have a license to make or have made, then they will be able to carry on selling to the other customers that they've announced that they're selling their QD panels to. The reason that we don't lose out because of that is those QD panels will be subject to royalty payments that the same. So if Samsung are selling a TV directly, we'll have a royalty. If they're selling it to another big OEM, we get a royalty. So we are being compensated for all sales of the infringing units. And then the question was, what options are available for accommodating this increased production? Well, as I say, on the back of the Samsung decision, there won't be. But as I mentioned earlier, when we were running through the presentation, we have production capacity in our Runcorn facility for between 2 and 3 million TVs, which is more than 100% of the non-Samsung CFQD TV market today. So it's more than adequate for us to get a toehold, whether it's with the number 2, number 3, number 4 company in the quantum dot TV markets, because their shares are only a couple of percentage points. Question 7, please can you give us your anticipated timelines on the German litigation? I think we've already talked about that. Will there be a patent review in Germany before the court case? Absolutely not. I think we said the German first decision will be next, did I say November 23. We're expecting the court case, whether it's the end of Q4 this year or Q1 next year. Next question, are we currently proceeding with litigation in UK and China, and do you have the timescales for these, please? We mentioned in the past, and we named those 2 markets as markets we're evaluating. Clearly, if we were litigating in those territories, that would be material news and we would announce it. We haven't announced it, so you can take it that we are not litigating in those right now. That does not mean that we are not evaluating it or that we're not taking steps to consider it or to start it. It just means we have not started. Question 8, is the delayed court case likely to have an impact on the anticipated placing of commercial order for Sensum quantum dots for the 4th quarter 2022? Absolutely not. As I mentioned, there's no technology or material connection between the court case and material set A or generation 1 sensing material. That's from our perspective. Our customer might have a different view. Customer might be waiting to see what happens, but we don't believe that's the case because they're wholly unconnected. Question 9, are any or all of the 5 patents for the PTAB decision used in the sensor technology? I've already said not material set A, but yes in sets B and C. Question 10, Are there any separate patents to the sensor technology? And if so, to what extent are they critical to the sensor application? I.e., are there ways people can get around NANOCO and get to the same results without licenses, etc.? Again, this is similar to what I said before. For material set A, that material has been around for decades. Yes, we've perfected it. Yes, we've got some trade secrets. Yes, we've got some know-how. We don't have much, if you like, filed patents on material set A, but we do in the other material sets. So simply on material set A, other people could try to make that, but we know it's very difficult. It's very challenging. We learned a lot working with the US customer and now on the same product with the European customer. So we think we've got, technological lead based on know-how, preparedness, the existence of a production facility, etc. Next question. NANOCO have gone to court on 3 of the 5 patent groups. How does this leave the remaining 2? For example, could these be taken to court separately? The ones that we dropped, almost all of them were dropped without prejudice, meaning we can bring them back anytime we want. The only exception to that is in this case, and I do mean this case, because Samsung actually had red dots excluded with prejudice in their motion, and we didn't oppose that, we couldn't come back on red against Samsung. But on everything else, it was dismissed or dropped without prejudice, so we could bring it back from the dead. Additional litigation action has been taken in Germany. Is this likely to be decided before the case in America? Well, I think when you see the timelines, you'll see we're likely to have a verdict in the US before we get an infringement decision in Germany. However, we're not likely to have an outcome to a final appeal process in America before Germany. So some parts of Germany are ahead, some parts are behind, but in general, more of the German decisions are earlier, with the exception of the actual initial verdict, because as I say, end of this year, early next year. Question 13, what determines whether court action is taken in other countries? At one time, for example, Japan was mooted. I mean, the markets that we look at, A, Samsung need to be selling a lot of TVs there, and B, we need to have IP coverage there. I think we've explained in the past that we think we cover roughly by volume 80 or 90% of Samsung's global TV sales with our patents. I've already talked about you'll take legal action if you think it's going to be fast, if you think it's going to be cheap, if you think it's a patent holder friendly territory, etc. So there's a whole bunch of different tactical and strategic factors that decide whether court action is going to be taken. I would like to think we do not have to sue Samsung in every territory around the world. I would like to think whether it's 2, 3, or 4 key territories, that's enough pressure in the mixer. Next question, question 14. Mobile phones can be listened into by third parties. People can be located via their use. There's potential for substantial awards in NANOCO, so the stakes are high. What steps are being taken to ensure the jury is not being nobbled? So besides our normal, our own normal level of security around our own networks, etc., I mean, I think this question, if Samsung actually, this question almost isn't worth answering. The idea that someone's going to try and nobble a jury is a whole different level of criminality. That is just, it'd be unconscionable. So I would put that in it's theoretically possible, but the idea that it's going to happen, call me naive, but anyone engaging in that, the repercussions for them would be enormous. So I don't really see that as a real risk, but obviously we're careful with our information, with our communication, with our networks. We do get our offices swept for bugs, etc., on an infrequent basis to make sure that our networks aren't compromised, so our tactics and our approach are not being compromised. Excuse me. Next question. From the statement you released with the results, are you now saying that the US court case is not likely to go ahead until H1 2023? No, not saying that at all. There are 2 more dates before Christmas. There are those 6 I mentioned after Christmas. We don't know. What I can say is when we are told and firmly told that we are going first, we have to announce that to the market immediately. Again, it's something we've noticed in some communications. the bad old days of companies being able to hold on to information for, a couple of days to coincide it with a results announcement, or I want to do it tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, those are long gone. The market abuse regulations, you will have seen, we will announce contracts, at 2 in the afternoon, at 4 in the afternoon, and people will ask, why didn't you do it at 7? Simple answer is market abuse regulations say you have to do it as soon as humanly possible, which means, sometimes you've got 30 minutes or an hour to announce these things. If the markets are closed, you can probably wait till the next day. But yes, as soon as we know that we are going to court and we're firm and we're number one, then we will tell the markets. Now, clearly, if the judge got sick on the day of the trial, it would all be off again. That's another of those risks, like the one earlier about sufficiency, etc. We won't necessarily comment on those. But no, so we're not saying it's going to be H1 23. We're just saying it could be H1 23, and I guess I'm saying Q1 23, if it's not Q4. Next question, are you aware, this one was submitted directly to the company actually, so this has come from our website. Are you aware of any other CFQD manufacturers that are potentially infringing NANOCO's patented IP? I think I mentioned earlier, we do not think it is possible to make CFQDs in any volumes unless you're infringing our IP. Now, there aren't many companies around the world that make CFQD in any sizable volumes. You've obviously got ourselves. You've got Hansel, who we know are supplying Samsung, and there's one, maybe two others, but that's it. Next question. Are you aware of anyone that is able to legitimately manufacture CFQD that doesn't infringe? I think that is the answer to the previous question. No is the simple answer. We don't think you can manufacture CFQD at scale without infringing our technology. Rolling through now, so that was all the pre-submitted ones. Jake, you'll have to shout at me if we're supposed to cut off, but I'm going to try and answer as many of these as we can. Should there be a settlement with Samsung, will the shareholders be informed via an RNS about the total amount of the settlement or about the amount NANOCO receives after deducting the percentage of the funder? I assume that NANOCO has to inform the shareholders of the amount, or is there a scenario where shareholders do not have to be informed? This one just goes back to the simple and very clear rules about market abuse and the release of inside information. There is no world whatsoever in which we could settle this case and not tell shareholders what it means. Now, that does not mean that if the agreement was a 55-inch TV's got a 0.75% royalty and a 65-inch TV's got a 1.1% royalty, you would never see that level of detail. But it is absolutely the case that we would, as a company, have to evaluate what we thought that settlement meant, including if there was a payment over 5 years, we would have to discount it. We'd have to pick a discount rate, but the market would have to be told this is what we think this means, because that's the legal obligation in any RNS. We have to tell you all of the important information, all the material information, all the inside information, but not all the commercially sensitive information. So there is no, again, I've seen the same question asked, would we then just find out in the next set of results? No, you would find out with, we might take 24 hours to talk to advisors, particularly if it was over the weekend, but we've got no choice but to inform the market and what it means. You might not get all the detail that you want, but you would get enough to be able to make an informed decision. If NANOCO wins the legal action against Samsung or a settlement is agreed, will the financial details? Oh, it's the same question. So no, you will not have to wait and see it in the accounts. And you'll be told, it's an X $1 million lump sum, and it's what we estimate is going to be Y million a year for Z number of years. It's going to be that level of information. If there are any material risks to it, so for example, if it was a Y million a year dependent on the number of sales, then we would estimate, without putting it into commercially sensitive numbers, what we think that amounts to. But bluntly, as I said, any announcement has to include enough information so the reader of that information can actually figure out what it means. Next question. You're more or less assuming that we should see visibility of a commercial order in H1 FY23 by January 31st and probably start production in H2 to CY23. I'm assuming you have a good idea what the product is and what the size of the order is. You don't have to give an exact figure, but can you give us an idea of what kind of revenue we're talking about? Less than $500,000 a year, etc. So the simple answer is we know what our product is. We do not know what the customer's product is. The reason for that is we know that our customer is exploring, and they've said it themselves, and they're active in a whole host of end markets, all of whom currently use CMOS sensors today. And it really is going to be about those end customers. And again, you can imagine when we were dealing with a US customer, they actually keep some of that information relatively tight to their chests. They do not want, the tail wagging the dog, i.e., the idea that NANOCO are going to announce that some global OEM is about to launch a product because we're a public company and have to make statements, that ain't going to happen. And the way that happens is that we don't know what the actual product is going to be. And that's why we've said it could be a headset. So it could be a couple of million units a year. It could be something in automotive. You're into tens of millions a year. It could be in consumer goods. If it gets into a mobile phone handset, then you're into the hundreds of millions of units a year. But our assumption, and again, you'll see it in the accounts and in the preliminary announcement, is that it's a low volume case. And by low volume case, I mean a few £1 million worth a year of production for that first order. If it ends up being bigger, great. We'll inform people that it's a bigger order. But as I said before, actually getting into production means you will then grow in that ecosystem. You'll get into more products. You'll get into more applications. And so it'll be a key event, whether or not it's a small volume order or a big volume order. And as I say, we've got the capacity to respond to large volume orders, but equally we can also service small volume orders. It's also worth noting that the smaller the volume, the higher the price, obviously, given that you're recovering a fixed cost base over a smaller number of units. And we, as I think I said earlier, even a low volume initial use case with just one application in a short period of time would get us to a break-even point. As I mentioned, break-even revenue for us, and I think Liam reiterated, break-even revenues around £5 million. So whether that's a combination of the low volume production plus some continued R&D income, that's what you're talking about as a conservative low volume initial use case assumption. Next question, please, can you clarify if the German injunction requires an IPR in Germany or if the validity of NANOCO's IP can be proved by the US PTAB outcome? Every territory is completely different. Unfortunately, you cannot draw any conclusions from winning in America. The German patent's actually written in German. No one's going to be surprised by that. I don't mean to be glib, but the German words, the language, the statements, etc., they have to be tested in Germany. So you might feel confident if you win in one territory, but it doesn't actually have a direct legal implication. The German court doesn't have to pay attention to what's in the US. In Germany, you file an infringement claim, a bit like America. Samsung, if they want, can invoke the equivalent of an IPR. And that's why I was saying we could end up with an infringement decision before validity in Germany, which would be the reverse of what we got in America. Next question. In the past, we have heard very often that this time there will actually be commercial orders, and unfortunately investors have been disappointed in this regard. What makes you more confident this time that NANOCO will get its first commercial order in FY23 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is 100% sure? So freely admit, I think we referred to it as we've been to the altar before. So back in 2015, we were at the altar, thought we were at the altar with Samsung, and we got jilted. So I know there's an in-house joke that actually we have commercialized our technology. Unfortunately, it's branded Samsung, and that's why we've got the lawsuit. We then had the US customer, and again, we've made clear they changed the design of their end-use device, which is why we were jilted at the altar that time. Nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the product or its capability. It was just the end user changing the design of their device. This time around, am I confident? And the basis for those confidence, so it's definitely more than 5. Yeah, there is no way I'd put it up at 10, because having been jilted twice before, and I was only here for one of those, things can always change. You do not know what is going to happen. But if you take the fact that our customer just signed up for a full year contract, they've already scheduled in the design of material set B, which is part of the product life cycle, i.e. A will go into production and B will one day replace that. So they're taking a very long-term view of this. They're a huge, significant player in the market. I've already mentioned all those other commercial customers that we're dealing with on a sensing perspective. So yes, you're asking me to put numbers on this. So whether it's a 6, whether it's a 7, whether it's an 8, I don't think I'd go to 9 or 10 because I'm a conservative sort of person. But I'd say on balance of probabilities, for me, it feels like a yes, it's going to happen. But of course, there are all those risks out there, so it doesn't have to happen. But we're working very hard, diversifying away from one customer, one product. That's why we've got 7 or 8 distinct customers, 12 distinct products, and re-engaging on display. So we've got a lot more arrows or a lot more bullets, whatever you want to call it, to shoot at the target. So that's why I'd be more confident or hopeful that something will hit. But obviously no guarantees until you're actually in production. Next question, will you be working with companies that are developing compound semiconductors, i.e. IQE, PLC? So again, there might be a technical aspect to this question, this bit about compound semiconductors. IQE, I believe, make VCSEL lasers. VCSEL lasers tend to be paired up with sensors because the laser emits and the sensor absorbs, etc. Again, we work directly with the sensor companies. So depending on our European customer, in fact, yes, 3 or 4 of the companies that we're working with, I would describe as compound semiconductor companies. So the European customer is a compound semiconductor company. We're also working with, our Asian customer is not a compound semiconductor company. They're a material science or chemical company, but we know their customer is the largest semiconductor company in the world. So hopefully that answers that question, but no direct read across to IQE. If NANOCO think other players are infringing their IP, why not notify them immediately? Why wait until the court case completes? I'm going to stray into metaphor here, and I'm somewhat wary of this because in the past, whether metaphors get misconstrued or whatever, but you don't want to fight too many wars and too many fronts all at the same time. A, you stretch your team. B, you stretch your advisors. And B, it costs a lot of money. Actually notifying people, again, you can do that. We may well have done it in some cases. I won't be drawn on that at the moment. But of course, if you poke the dragon or the tiger and the tiger decides to stand up and bite back, then you've got your fight on your hands, whether you wanted one or not. So declaring war on all fronts at the same time, it would be a strategy. Some companies do that. Clearly, NANOCO, with our resources, we'd much rather have a focused approach to get the win. And frankly, as we've explained before, Samsung is 90% of the QD TV market. So the others financially, particularly in the US, well, the money might not even be worth it. And getting an injunction to stop someone selling 50,000 TVs in, South Africa wouldn't be worth even trying to do. So that's our strategy. Get the win on the single biggest target there is by far. And then once you've got that, because frankly, if you go to other people and you say, hey, my IP is valid, you need to stop infringing, they'll say, well, prove it, because you haven't actually had a court case yet and your IPRs are up for appeal. So why should we pay any attention to you? So we will get to them in time. The ideal outcome is you win Samsung and actually everybody else then volunteers to surrender before you even have to fire a shot, which is a plausible outcome as well. Next question, does Dow still have a working CFQD factory in Korea? They still have a facility. Our understanding is it's been mothballed for some time, so I don't know how quickly, if it could be turned on. Mothball factories do have a way of deteriorating. Equally, they sometimes get cannibalized for parts. But our understanding is, and certainly our agreement with Dow is still in place, that yes, they still have a facility. But whether or not they're spitting out any CFQDs, even at a sample size, I couldn't comment on that. Excuse me. Focus on the organic business seems to be to get to break even. What's the size of the revenue opportunity a few years out? I think the reason we target break even is, and there's almost 3 steps here. So step 1 is get into commercial production, which if you didn't have any R&D or anything else and it was a low use case, might not on its own get you to break even. So job number 1 or job number 2, after you're in commercial production, get to break even. The reason that we highlight that is that that's not our goal. That's not where we want to end up. But given the funding challenges the business has had over the last number of years and the fact that, we still are loss-making, we still run out of money, that's a big, again, qualitative milestone or threshold to achieve. After that, then you can start focusing on more aggressively pushing out the volume. And again, I think we've explained that working a single shift in our Runcorn sensing facility can deliver anywhere between 15 and 20 million pounds a year of revenue, with roughly 25% material costs, gross margins around 40-50%, and healthy EBITDA numbers. If you can get to that sort of 15-20 million revenue number on a single shift. If you ran Runcorn sensing 24/7, you're closer to $100 million, £100 million, of income. And then on the display side, it's smaller. It's about a quarter of that size at full volume loaded. So if it was running 24/7, you might be able to generate 20-25 million of revenue. So clearly there is a lot of upside after you get to that 5 million break-even number. We haven't set any targets after that, what would be a useful 3 or 5 year target. I think once we get into commercial production, and certainly once we're getting closer to that break-even revenue figure, that's when we'll be revising targets, because it'll be easier to plan forward, plan further out, and set what we would see as a sensible goal for a 3-year revenue figure after we've got to break even. But clearly, no one would be satisfied just with getting to break even. The job then would be to push on and go further into the ecosystem, more devices, more customers. Simon L., I think we've already addressed this. Will there be legal arguments of validity in the Texan trial, or has this all been addressed at the PTAB? So yes, theoretically, it is possible that there could be arguments of validity at the Texan trial, but I think I don't think I could have been plainer. We only comment on risks that we think are material or that folk need to know about, and we haven't chosen to comment on those validity risks. So draw your own conclusions from that on whether or not you think you should pay attention to it or consider it if we're not feeling the need to talk about it at length. Next question, will there be an RNS from NANOCO when there's visibility of production or only when there's an official commercial order? I think that is going to be the latter, an official commercial order, without necessarily just hiding behind the rules. Inside information has to be sufficiently precise. I should tell you, and it's ancient history, but we actually had a contract signed by us with the US customer 3 years ago for another product. If we'd announced that as visibility of production order, people would have got awfully excited. But the truth is, 6 weeks later, the US customer decided, no, I don't want to push forward, so I'm not going to sign it. So it's always a judgment. When is something sufficiently firm? Because I don't think anyone would thank me for saying, yes, I'm really confident. I might sound like, other CEOs and other companies, saying, oh, yes, this time tomorrow we're all going to be millionaires, or, next month there'll be production, That's why, we're using conservative or careful language around visibility of production. But when we get an actual commercial order, even if it's a relatively small one, because of the substantive importance or qualitative importance of us actually being in commercial production, I think it's reasonable to assume that there would be an RNS. We wouldn't be able to go into commercial production and not tell people. Andrew L., has there been any further progress on the COVID test? Simple answer is not really. Again, we are focusing our efforts and resources. So we got through to a fully functioning prototype. We actually tested it against other pathogens. But again, if that one's going to move forward, A, if we had more financial resources, then we might consider it. B, it's definitely going to require partners to go forward in that area, because you're starting to move away from our core competencies around, electronics uses and applications for our CFQDs. Then the next question, this might be the last one, and I apologize for overrunning with people. Simplistic, I know, but if you don't know how Samsung manufacture their dots, how can you know they are infringing your IP? Okay, you have to differentiate between us and our lawyers, between NANOCO and our lawyers, between NANOCO, our lawyers, and our expert witnesses. The information inside each of their heads is different. So we can use all the available public information. And I'll give you an example. Samsung, in their external presentations, refer to something as a magic cluster. Okay? And that's one of their key parts of making a cadmium-free quantum dot. We, in our patents, refer to something called a molecular cluster compound. Now, everyone can see the use of the word cluster. Hang on, what exactly does that mean? So you can actually interrogate some of the publicly available information, because no one actually publicly announces their full actual production processes. But you can get enough clues, you can get enough hints, you can get enough evidence in what they're saying publicly that actually you could legitimately infer that a magic cluster actually just is a molecular cluster compound, but by a different name. No doubt that will be one of the debates that will happen in front of the jury. So I think that's answering your question. Clearly, you can't be absolutely sure, but by now, if Samsung had a recipe that meant that it was clear they were not infringing our IP, that would have been submitted. And actually, if we looked at it and said, well, it's obviously they're not, they're making CFQDs using marshmallows and sugar, then you drop your case pretty quickly, because you're going to lose. So the fact that none of that has come out through discovery, and that we're still confident in the merits of our case, and our advisors' confidence in the merits of our case, that we'll go in front of the jury, and ultimately the jury will make the final decision on whether they have or they haven't. So I understand the rationale behind the question, and hopefully those answers or comments I've made explain it rather than make it more complex or murky. So that, I think, is the end, Jacob.
Brian, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for addressing all of those questions that came in from investors this morning. And of course, if any more questions do come through, we'll make these available to you immediately after the presentation has ended for you to review, and then add any additional responses where it's appropriate to do so. Brian, perhaps before redirecting those on the call to provide you with their feedback, which I know is particularly important to yourself and the company, if I could please just ask you for a few closing comments to wrap up with, that'd be great.
Okay. So I think just to close, financial year 22, it was a big year for us. We knew we were going to have the PTAB outcome. Everything could have ended on the litigation there, which would have had serious implications for the value of our IP, the value of our display business, for the company itself. So that was a big deal, getting through those IPRs and getting the outcome that we got. It was a big deal, the pre-trial conference. It was also a big deal on the organic business, getting that full year contract extension from a customer. And again, if people are looking for signs of confidence, that's their confidence. So if they're confident, we can be confident. So FY22 was definitely a big year. A lot got delivered. And FY23, we've got even more to look forward to. The jury trial, when it happens by the end of this year, early next year, it's not the last hurdle. You've still got appeals. There's still stuff to happen. As I mentioned, this could drag on for a while, but that's going to be a big deal. And obviously, the further on you are and the more successes you gather as you go along, your negotiating position, if you want to call it that, just gets stronger as you go. The fact that we are expecting certainly our products to be production ready, we're still expecting to be in commercial production, even if it's low volume initial use case before the end of this financial year. So FY23, if you like, FY22 was a big year. FY23 is going to be a bigger year again, and our whole team's working hard to deliver in both of those, not just for the team itself, our internal stakeholders, but also for all of our shareholders. Thank you very much for your time today and all those questions that have been submitted.
Brian, that's great. And Liam as well. Thank you once again for taking the time to update investors today. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This won't take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of NANOCO Group PLC, we would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, so good morning to you all.